All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Let There Be Talk. We have a fantastic guest today. Introduce yourself, my man.
That's just because you couldn't remember.
That's not true.
Hi, everybody. I'm Norman Perry, and very pleased to be coming to you through some sort of superficial landline, internet, whatever it is, newfangled scenario. It's not quite stand-up comedy, but it's pretty awesome that we can be doing this. Thank you very much for asking me.
Oh, yeah. An honor to have you on, my man. I first was made aware of you because somebody said that you had tour managed or worked on the Back in Black tour. So that was my original thing of like, oh, well, we've got to have him on. And then as we did a little pre-chat on the telephone, it just unraveled that you are way more than that. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit.
Well, anywhere you want to start, I'm happy, Dean. But the reality is that I started my career in Canada in my late teens. I started working for the big promoting company that was based in Montreal, and found myself not too many years later working for an even bigger promoting company in England, which led me eventually 5 or 6 years later back to Western Canada, started my own promoting company. And it was during that time that unfortunately Bon died and Brian was brought in to replace AC/DC. And I had the distinct honor of hosting the very first two Back in Black tour shows in Western Canada. So Brian's first North American gigs, they had done a couple club shows, I think in Holland or maybe Belgium, but their very first arena shows were in Calgary and Edmonton in July of 1980. This year is the 40th anniversary of one of the greatest rock albums ever. And pretty big shoes to fill, obviously coming off of Highway to Hell, which was, I guess, the album that really zoomed AC/DC to the forefront of the American, both radio and concert scene. They had been, I think, probably through the market one or two times before, but Highway to Hell really sort of took it to the next level. And then unfortunately in February of 1980, Bon passed away in London. And really weeks later, they had auditioned dozens of singers. They had agreed to work with Brian. They recorded one of the most seminal albums ever. And then they began a tour right across Canada. So it went from west to east, and then it jumped into the States, and it just never stopped. I mean, they toured nonstop for about 18 months. I wore another hat in those days and still do. The company that I worked with in England actually evolved from the promoting company into a merchandising company as well. And they had the distinct honor of being the merchandise company of record for a lot of very big British bands, and also for AC/DC on that tour. And I've essentially been working with AC/DC one way or the other since 1980, either as a promoter or as their merchandiser. And currently my company in New York here is named after that original company in Vancouver. We call it Perryscope, and AC/DC, Pink Floyd, Bad Company, so many others are clients of mine, and I could not be happier to go to work.
That's wild. I saw the Back in Black tour at the Cow Palace, and it's interesting too, because when you do look at some of the size of the venues that were originally booked for that tour, you can tell that people aren't quite sure what level they're going to be at. They were doing some good theaters on the Highway to Hell tour, and they were really absolutely taking off, but not to this level that you would just be like, well, Back in Black's out, a new singer, we're just going to do 15,000 seaters. So
you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I think they used Canada as a bit of a proving ground. The interesting thing about Canada is, while it is small, it has a very dedicated music scene within the industry. And the record companies work very closely with the radio stations. Remember radio stations? The companies work very, very closely with the promoters. And whenever possible, they tried to convince the agents who control the destiny of the routing, and the managers who ultimately they report to, and the musicians that the managers work for. They were trying to convince them to do more sort of full-on Canadian tours, the way you do a full-on British tour or a full-on Australian tour. And prior to that, and with no malice, quite often a big band, and let's say it was Zeppelin or Purple or Sabbath or Tull or whatever, they'd go in and they'd play maybe 3 or 4 in the Northeast and on the Canadian side. In Montreal, Toronto, definitely. Sometimes you could convince them to throw in Ottawa or Quebec City. Vancouver, often because of Seattle, coming up the coast, as you said, go from the Cow Palace, a couple of days later you're in Vancouver. And slowly but surely you'd hop into Calgary, Edmonton, but it was only a handful of bands that saw the value of going coast to coast. One of those bands was Nazareth. Another one of those acts was Joan Armatrading. Another one was Elvis Costello. At various different levels of their career, they realized that they could make a lot more friends that ultimately were friends for life, and they'd sell a lot more records if they went and played more than 3 or 4 cities. So we were very fortunate to work with an agency who are no longer with us, but that agency was an agency called ATI, and they really did believe in touring Canada, and they had a lot of acts like Kiss as an example, and you know, others that they convinced to go coast to coast, and one of them was also AC/DC. So it was a very interesting time in the business. You know, the venue thing, as you say, I've been involved in. Elvis Costello is a perfect example where the tour was booked in small halls and it got just so crazy, the demand. I mean, last year, Billie Eilish, I guess it was the exact same thing, you know, so, you know, everything can repeat itself. The tour was so hot and there was so much demand and the scalpers were taking over the streets and everybody was getting frustrated that they moved up into bigger venues. But originally when they booked it, they had to be safe. Nobody wants to have an empty seat. Nobody wants to play one more song than you know, no one likes to overstay their welcome. So they wanted to make sure everything was a sellout. But in the end, I remember in Vancouver, the venue that we upgraded it to was not the most popular. The acoustics were not great. It would have been perfect for, you know, the Clash or whatever, something with a lot more intensity. But for Elvis's audience, they got a little bit frustrated and I was called the man. You know, all of 25, I became the man.
Yeah.
Because I had taken it from a 3,000 seater to a 7,000 seater. It wasn't even a 12,000 seater, but I was still vilified for doing that. Yet, you know, as you know, it's impossible to see every single show at the Wiltern or every single show at the Fillmore. I mean, eventually a band does outgrow that.
Absolutely.
And with no malice, I mean, you know, I'm proud that I worked with you two in a 1,000-seater, but I'm equally proud that I worked with them many times in a 50,000-seater. And the same could be said for the, you know, for the Police and many other artists. And we, you know, we've seen that if you look at, you know, any band's touring history, you know, one tour they've got the backup singers, one tour they add the keyboard player, you know, another tour they add the big production. And some say it's not as good and others say it's just as good and others say I don't have anything to compare it to. And in the end, it becomes a scrapbook of your mind or, you know, your coffee table book. And people like you and I can talk about, well, Neil Young on that Shocking Pinks tour, what did you think when he started playing all that hillbilly stuff? And somebody say, well, I remember, you know, when Lou Reed was fighting with the record company and he went out and did the worst record ever, or Tin Machine for David Bowie, but they're all part of a career. It's just what people have to accept. No musician, no real great musician wants to stand still.
Yeah.
Right?
What is your, it's funny because you say you wore many hats and one of them seemed to be a concert promoter at 25. How do you
Actually, I started way younger than that. I was a veteran at 25.
Wow. How do you get into that?
Well, you know, you got to start somewhere. And I had just, again, you know, my own personal 9-year-old experience with Ed Sullivan and the Beatles, right? So that's my immediate epiphany. Prior to that, maybe I was picking up some music from my parents, and you either inherit a bit of early Elvis or great Frank Sinatra, or you inherit fat Elvis and you say, what's the fuss? But, you know, I picked up on, you know, Everly Brothers and things of that nature, segueing into some great stuff like Jan and Dean and the Beach Boys. But the one that really connected to me, obviously, was the Beatles. And from that point onward, my career in music really began. And very soon after discovering that I was probably the worst drummer in Canada, I went into the organizational side as opposed to the performance side, because I still wanted to be, as you do, on one side of the curtain, right? I know you're a performer.
Yeah.
And you know, what took you from the audience to the stage was things you had to say or things you thought you could communicate. Well, I wasn't a communicator. I wasn't a creator. I wasn't, you know, a performer, songwriter, but I loved being on that organizational side. It led me in my high school years to booking the bands at the high school dances and buying the bands from an agent whose roster I didn't really think was good enough. At that point, Hendrix was starting to come on and Cream had come along, and you know, his bands all were cover bands doing Tommy James and the Shondells hits. And so I sort of went in as the little know-it-all at 15 or 16 saying, these bands aren't good enough for my friends in my high school. And they sort of gave me a chance to prove myself right or wrong, which led to a summer job, which led to a subsequent summer job, which led to a full-time job as their stage manager, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a natural thing, but after the fact, you know, when you think about it, there was no university course how to be a promoter. There was no set knowledge, and you know, the business was in its infancy. People like Brian Epstein were blowing up the world of, you know, of whatever had happened in the generation before for other types of performers. They became the go-to, and people like Peter Rudge, who were involved with the Stones very, very early, and Bill Kirbishley with the Who, and then Frank Barcelona, the super agent, and all these other people, they were starting an industry, a concert industry, a rock concert industry that didn't exist before. You know, so I was a little younger than those original promoters, the Bill Grahams or whatever, but I was old enough to get a job with one of them. And when I went to England, I got a job with the dominant promoting company in England, and their client roster read like a who's who. It was Stones, and it was the Floyd and Roxy Music and Genesis, and you know, all sorts of very, very eclectic acts. And I got to work with those tours in Britain, sometimes as the promoter rep, sometimes as the sort of lackey for the crew, you know, the guy that made sure the catering was there. And eventually I became a junior promoter, and that's how I learned. And many of the artists that I work with now, I developed initial relationships with them or their managers or their agents or their employees in my early 20s.
Do you remember, like, were you the sole promoter for AC/DC on the Back in Black? Meaning, was it your money that you were putting up for the guarantees and the room rentals and equipment and all that, the sound system?
Yeah, I mean, again, don't forget, it wasn't it wasn't until really the 80s with a guy named Jerry Weintraub, and subsequent with a guy that has been my partner for many years, Michael Cole, where these super tours, these sort of one promoter tours, Live Nation or AEG now they're called, get the acts for the entire, you know, planet.
Of course.
In those days, you were regional. You know, the way it was set up is that, you know, somebody had Southern California, somebody had Northern California, somebody had Oregon, somebody had Washington State, and usually it was two guys that fought in each of those territories.
Absolutely.
You know, and outside of Bill, who didn't have a lot of competition, there were 2 or 3 companies in Seattle and 2 or 3 companies in LA. And I became one of several companies that promoted in Vancouver. But the answer to your question is, as a promoter, whether you have a backer or you have your own money, you are responsible for 100% of your loss. And so that tour, funnily enough, though, as a national tour, was a partnership with my original company out of Montreal, a company called Donald K. Donald Productions, and another fellow whose company was called Concert Productions International out of Toronto, Michael Cole. And Michael Cole subsequently became the promoter of the Rolling Stones, who replaced Bill Graham. But many of the shows I did in Vancouver, most of the shows I did in Vancouver, my company, you know, Perryscope, we financed the company, those shows, and we took our lumps when we had to. I do remember, you know, a couple real stinkers, but generally speaking, the agents, if you get to know them, are fair. And If you get to know your numbers. I mean, the numbers never lie. You've got to know what your break even is. You've got to know what your expenses are. And you've also got to run a first-class show. You can't be a junior promoter or the new kid on the block and not have a great security guy or a great caterer or a great, production manager, or anything else about you can't be second class, or they're not coming back to you. So, it doesn't matter how old you are. It really, what you have to do is deliver service. And I'm sure you've been through that movie yourself where, if the hotel booking isn't there for you, or, they haven't given you any tea in your dressing room, or any of the other things that come with touring, you sit back and you say to your manager or your peeps, and you say, that guy didn't cut it for me. So
Yeah.
I want to be the guy that didn't cut it for somebody. I want to be the guy that they say, we want to go back to Vancouver as soon as we can.
There's an interesting, me growing up around Bill Graham. I personally feel like he's the reason I have such deep music taste and eclectic taste. But also, I looked at him as like the ultimate in work ethic. And I learned a lot from him by not knowing him. I've only met him a couple times, but by watching what he was doing. And there's a very a great part in his book where he talks about where he sits down with Mick Jagger at the Oakland A's baseball park and says, I want to do this across America. And it's kind of the early days, I don't know if you agree with this, of the one man taking the band across America. And then as you read later in the book, how sad he was to lose him to Michael Cole. Do you, have you read that book?
Well, I've read that excerpt, and again, there's three sides to the truth, and he can't even be here to defend his position. And I don't know who the editor was, or the, or the context. I can only say that there's a point where even with your friends that have that hit single, the guy that's the drum tech just can't cut it anymore, and he's your best friend, or he's your brother, or he was your road manager, and he just can't do the job. And so eventually, and I'm not saying Bill couldn't do the job by no means, but I'm just saying sometimes you outgrow a certain type of a deal. And I think that the deal that worked so efficiently for the Stones with Bill needed some, let's just say, some radical surgery. And I think what Michael proposed to Prince Rupert and ultimately to Mick and the band was a significant quantum leap. It combined all sorts of revenue streams. It really treated the artist like a partner with the promoter, and it brought in sponsorship, and it brought in ancillary revenue from VIP ticketing and from bus packages and clearly from merchandising and any number of other things, pay-per-view. And, Michael was able to show the band that there were 100 apples on a tree, and maybe Bill had always thought there were 13. The difference between 13 and 100 isn't the difference between 88 and 100. And it wasn't that Bill wasn't great at what he did. He was a phenomenal producer. Your point about some of his shows outside of Europe, where they had a history of it, Bill would put Miles Davis, the equivalent of a Miles Davis Metallica package together, and no one would say, what the hell's he doing? It would be one of those great nights at the Fillmore or at Winterland. So he was a very good impresario. One of my clients is the band, and their story starts and ends with Bill Graham. The Last Waltz is one of the great rock experiences, and phenomenal film, considered one of the best rock films that Scorsese did, and that had a lot to do with Bill Graham having the vision to show the band, Robbie, everybody, Levon, the entire organization, how to go out with a beautiful farewell. So, I think the reality was that there were things that were going to change as an audience got older. And I mean, look, we're all going to hopefully hang on to our heroes, but we make a lot of those friends, anywhere from 8 to 15 years old. That's when you first bump into AC/DC. That's when you first bump into Pink Floyd, or even the Foo Fighters. You bump into them and you want to stick with them. If they maintain their consistency, you're going to maintain your loyalty. And therefore, I think one of the things that was clearly different by the time that Mick and Keith had that kind of 8 years apart, that by 1989, which is
Steel Wheels.
Steel Wheels took place, if you wanted to try to get the $100 a ticket, and you wanted to play a stadium, and you wanted to play on a Wednesday as opposed to a Saturday, most of the audience had jobs, and most of the audience didn't want to skip work. Some had to. They were traveling from San Diego. But, if you lived in San Francisco, you wanted to, be able to do your day thing and do your night thing. Reserved seating was a way that could happen. And you didn't have to sit in your seat. You just had to be at your seat. And, Bill, and even to an extent, I think the band had grown up with this sort of festival seating, the day on the green experience, et cetera. And it seemed a little less rock and roll to do reserve seating. But in reality, the audience, therefore, didn't have to get there at 8 in the morning, queue up to run down to the front, and then have to beg somebody to hold their place while they went off to find a bathroom. They could come whether they wanted to see the opening act or not see the opening act. They'd come when they wanted, and they know exactly where their seat was. And again, as I said, they didn't have to stand, they didn't have to sit and feel like they were watching a theatrical performance. They were still watching the world's greatest rock band. So that was, again, one of those things where I think, Michael and our company at the time, had certain producing ideas that didn't involve whether there should be an elephant on stage or whether there should be this amount of fireworks, because that was always what the band did themselves, and they did it brilliantly. Our idea was, what was the best way to get an audience to come comfortably and pay for a show that was as expensive as it was. Steel Wheels was a quantum leap beyond anything any band had ever done. And the Stones outperformed themselves even after that, on Voodoo Lounge and all the other tours. They just wouldn't stand still. And neither would people like the Floyd or Bowie. They always evolved. And so when you put that much money into technology and pay your crew really well, and you have, an enormous amount of touring costs, then you have to turn that into some ticket pricing. And when you get to a point where you can't do 6 shows in a week, or you can only do 3.5 shows in a week because, your body can't do it, eventually that again leads to decisions about, what to charge and how to produce the show.
Right.
So I again, I'm not privy to what Bill did or didn't, say to the Stones or to Mick personally. I just know that I think we came with some fresh ideas, and I'm very honored that they said yes to them. But, it was still their show. It was entirely their show.
Right. It's funny to look back at those Day in the Greens, because the artist Dennis Larkin, he was doing those scrims and those theme stages of, like, say, the Castle for Peter Frampton, or Zeppelin with the Stonehenge and all that stuff. It seems like later on that was all kind of ground zero for making band stages later not just look like scaffolding, like, say, a Woodstock looking stage.
Well, don't forget Woodstock stage that they wanted, they couldn't get built in time.
Right.
And so, in fairness, because many of the people that worked on the Woodstock production were alumni of Bill's East Coast operation. So what you see in the film is not what they conceived, it's what they ended up having to put up. But, I don't know if I fully concur. I think it was maybe it was a precursor to the Ultimate Stadium show. But I saw, like, again, as the little stage manager in Montreal, and then eventually it led me to England, I saw with bands like the Floyd, that quad sound, or the first plane that was rigged and came down and crashed over the stage, which later became the Pig, as you know. The band Jethro Tull were one of the most innovative staging bands. You think of them as a prog rock sort of thing, and Ian standing on one foot with the flute, and all of that thing. But they on Thick as a Brick and Aqualung, they had phenomenal staging. So it was happening all the time. Chip Monk, who was the production manager for 2 major Stones tours. He turned the world upside down when he had those follow spots on the back of the stage shining onto mirrors that were over the band, and they were coming right back. These beams, instead of coming from 80 feet or 100 feet or 200 feet away, they were coming with intensity from the back of the stage and bouncing right back onto the stage. So every tour, every major artist has an opportunity to say, how do I take more than the music and create an immersive scenario? And sometimes it is a backdrop, and sometimes it's an audio presentation, and sometimes it's pyro, and in the end, it leads to what we can talk about this many years later, and that is, what was your favorite so-and-so show? Not what was your favorite show, but what was your favorite so-and-so show? Because you might have wanted to see each and every tour, knowing that, Bowie's never going to do the same show. And so you have to check out the next one. And my wife still says the Station to Station tour, when she saw it, was all white, the white stage, white lights, all different types. That was the favorite show she's ever seen in her life. She still talks about it this many years later. So, that's not to say the music wasn't perfect. I think if the music had been lousy, if the musicianship hadn't been what it was, the staging is irrelevant.
Yeah. What do you think about how much of a pinnacle role, as far as the changing of the guard, money-wise, that Peter Grant had when he finally said Zeppelin gets 90%, the promoter gets 10%? What do you think about that? Because I think it opened a lot of bands' eyes, like, whoa, wait a minute, we can get more money.
Well, first of all, he was at the beginning of that run working with Frank Barcelona, who was one of the great agents, because he had an alliance with the promoters, and they had a fierce loyalty to him, and it went 2 ways. But he had an enormous vision about how to make his bands more money. And yes, we started in an industry, and when the promoter paid a flat, took all the risks, and all the back end was the promoters. And eventually somebody sat back and said, whoops, you said you were going to sell 6,000 tickets, you sold 9. What's in it for us? Or, just they were surrounded by wiser people. In the beginning, you're just happy to be in the studio. In the beginning, you're happy to be touring. Eventually, you sit back and say, how do I turn this into a career so I can buy a house, and so I can take some time off? And that leads to tour accountants, and it leads to business managers, and it leads to very savvy agents. And, there are some brilliant agents out there that have helped reinvent deal making, not just Frank Barcelona. Howard Rose for Elton John was another very innovative agent, and Mark Geiger has been a hugely innovative agent. But to go back to your specific question, it was 90-10 of profit. So costs came off the top, so the band was paying 90% of the costs. So if they had too many steak dinners, they paid 90% of the steak. If they had too many, if they asked for too many whatevers, bottles of champagne, they were paying 90% of it. So in some ways they were backing themselves, right? They wanted, as much of that profit as they could get, but they also allowed you to charge a reasonable ticket price. It wasn't quite the, we want a 90-10 and everybody has to pay $10 scenario. If they felt that everybody was charging 10 and they were the biggest band on the road, they would be happy to charge 15. And therefore, the promoter was sharing in a slightly larger takeout than had they done it the other way. But in the end, if you want 90% of the glory, you should take 90% of the blame. And Led Zeppelin didn't leave a lot of unsold tickets that I can remember, so they deserve that back end. I think it led to some unfortunate situations. I think that we've all overpaid. I don't know if you've ever felt you've been overpaid, or if a promoter's ever come to you and said, hey, Dean, look, I got hurt tonight. That can happen. But right now, there are these ancillary revenue streams that promoters who are associated with strong venues, whether they own them or they have an ongoing series with the venue, where they can participate in other revenues. Sometimes it's in ticketing, sometimes it's in merchandising, sometimes it's in food and beverage. And, as a result of that, your 90-10 is focused on one sort of side of the revenue. The bands rarely participate in the other side of the revenue, which is another reason why I think the Stones liked the Cole approach, is because it brought in other revenue streams.
Yeah. What do you think, who was really responsible for the merch explosion? Is it Kiss? Because if you look at, I collect a lot of rock merch, t-shirts specifically, there's really not a lot of shirts until around, I would say, 80. It's hard to find a Led Zeppelin shirt, and they were the biggest band on the planet all through the 70s. And it's hard to find, say, an Eagle shirt. They're out there, but it's pretty rare compared to what you did in the 80s.
I think you're partly right, but not totally right. The modern merchandising business sort of did begin with bands like the Stones and Led Zeppelin. And some of the people they did the deals with were people who were working in the venues already. So they might have been the concessionaire at the LA Forum who already was experienced with making merch for the LA Kings, and maybe the Lakers, but wasn't really as experienced for touring. And then eventually 3 companies emerged. Bill Graham had Winterland off the relationships of Santana and the Grateful Dead. And, you know, there's no doubt that Winterland went on to great, great things. As a matter of fact, the successor company of the successor company, is still run by one of Bill's alumni, Del Ferrano. The success and the leverage and the power of the manager, Phil Walden, evolved from mostly, well, originally, you know, his relationship with Otis Redding, but it really started with the Allman Brothers exploding, and he turned that power base into Great Southern, and they had lots and lots of great artists, starting with Charlie Daniels and the Outlaws, and, you know, super amount of Southern-based bands. And then the company that I left Montreal to end up going and work with, they became the backers of 2 young guys who formed a company with us called Brockham. And Brockham became the tour merchandisers for mostly British bands. Like I said earlier, it was bands like Roxy Music and ELP and Yes, and Rick Wakeman when he left Yes, and Genesis. So many of those bands. And when they started to come back to America or go to Australia, Brockham went with them. And when Winterland, you know, had an act that went to England, they set up an operation on the other side. And so that was really the mid-70s, Dean. And I can tell you that, you know, we sold an enormous amount of Who merchandise in the 70s, an enormous amount of Floyd merchandise on the Animals tour in 77. Because I worked for the band on that tour, but Brockham was also the merch company. So I think you're off by maybe 5 years, but there were certain acts and certain types of acts that did sell more. And your point about Kiss is twofold. A, great logo. B, very entrepreneurial band members. And C, a brilliant marketing original manager in Bill Aucoin. And that whole myth about Kiss caught on, and it worked. But all the hard rock bands, from Sabbath to, you know, to even Boston and Van Halen, you know, they did do excellent merch sales. You could argue that, you know, it's easier to sell a Megadeth t-shirt than a Phil Collins t-shirt. But you can sell a lot more Phil Collins tickets and a lot more Phil Collins records. So, you know, it's a balance.
Yeah.
But there, you know, my son has quite often shown me, you know, $800 versions of shirts that we sold for $15. And they're hard to come by, but I'd like to actually say they're hard to come by because they weren't shitty. They were pretty good, and they don't go on the market unless they're shitty, or unless somebody dies or they're cleaning up a basement and they go, oh, where'd these come from? Or you've really grown, because recently I've had a few older shirts come my way, and they're very undersized. And it's not that they were undersized, it's just that we've now all gotten a little, you know, thicker.
Of course.
In the last 3 or 4 years, I do remember, you know, I think one night on a Bad Company tour, we sold more double XLs and triple XLs than we sold smalls, mediums combined. You know, smalls, mediums, and larges combined. But you grow with your audience. And the other thing we had to do in merchandise is respect the fact that, you know, despite what you might see at certain shows, there are a lot of women that like rock and roll, and there's a lot of women that like hard rock, but if you don't give them the right product, they're not buying it. So we had to smarten up a bit and stop doing unisex shirts and start doing, ladies specific garments, which eventually led to this other side of the world that's completely exploded, which is, the rock retail industry is massive. And there are probably 30 or 40,000 stores around the world that sell sort of licensed merchandise of the great classic rock acts. So Janis Joplin, Genesis, the Police, Floyd, as I've been talking about, certainly AC/DC, they sell millions of shirts to people who've never seen the bands. Probably might not even know who's dead or alive. In the case of the Ramones, it's just it's sort of a badge of honor. And so it's not just the concert experience, it's trying to say that rock and roll, like pop culture, like, the Yankees, like Iron Man or Superman or any number of other things, it translates from generation to generation. And there's a bragging right associated with being able to wear a shirt that says Woodstock on it.
It's funny how big the rock merch world is. I mean, it is massive, and how little rock is looked at in the industry, say, per se, record companies, which is really funny, right?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not gonna get into saying, Drake is the new Elvis or Drake is the new Otis. I'm happy to say that while I did share the Beatles with my parents, they hated the Stones, right? And so there has to, and well, you could say the same thing of Slayer and Megadeth and Metallica and Testament. A lot of people said that's a little bit too speedy. It's a little bit too loud. It's not melodic enough. I can't sing it in the shower. And you could say that when you heard prog rock for the first time and you were hearing King Crimson or early Genesis, you didn't quite get it. And it's okay to not get something, and it's okay to, after the fact, go back and say, now I understand why people love Miles Davis, or now I get, Procol Harum. And so one day maybe they'll say that about, Post Malone. And if I live to be 110, I might be able to say that. But right now, it's okay that I don't like it, and it's super okay that millions do, right?
Oh, I mean, I like it. I've never been a what I call a tumbleweed out there. Like, what happened? There's no good music. I've grown over the years. I mean, I listen to everything from Zappa to later on, once NWA hits and all that. That's fantastic. To right now, current stuff. But I'm just talking as far as an industry goes.
I think you're right. It's a bit of an endangered species. Rock and roll or rock is a bit endangered. That being said, the New York Times had an article a couple of weeks ago that 50 different people sent me, and it was about the guitar is back.
Yeah.
It's one of the things, I mean, I was involved for 4 or 5 years with some of the biggest EDM festivals, and, I did miss live musicians. I truly did, and I still do. And I think there's something about a drummer drumming or a bass player playing, or certainly a guitar player, that's not replaceable. And I do think that we're cyclical in some of this stuff. But I think there's room for everybody. I think there's always been room for everybody, because when the Beatles and the Stones and all the British bands were dominating, so were the Motown acts, and so were the Tamla acts. And so, there's all sorts of overlaps. And I keep saying this because sometimes we are faced with somebody who's not as maybe prepared to understand the value and the importance of Creedence Clearwater, or the value and the importance of, what Bad Company did when they came under the wing of Led Zeppelin, and how they were able to just crash onto that scene. So you're sometimes talking to somebody who's a little less prepared, and you don't want to be condescending, but in the end, the public generally know what they want. They find it anyway. But you can like Joni Mitchell and Metallica, and you can like Metallica and the New York Mets, and you can like steak and sushi. And not enough people want to admit that. You're one guy that just did admit it. But there are a lot of people that stay in a funnel or stay in a silo, and that's all they want. And that's okay as well. Speed metal only, not even thrash metal, not even heavy metal. Just want, that's okay. But most people, I think, eventually say, you know what, I'm going to try the yogurt.
Yeah. I think that came around really because growing up in the 70s, I've said it a lot, You just turn on the radio and you're going to hear Zeppelin, then you'll hear the Eagles, then you're going to hear Otis, then you'll hear Janis Joplin, then you'll hear the OJs, and then you'll hear Earth, Wind, and Fire. I think somewhere along the way, once punk rock came in, is really when there was this divide of like, I only listen to punk rock, everything else is corporate bullshit. And it really started to segregate these pockets of styles and genres and all that, you know?
Well, that's true, and but you know there've always been snobs. There were jazz snobs and there were bebop snobs, right? And there were, you know, obviously there's classical snobs. There's still some people that define music, you know, as classical music, or take it or leave it. You know, they don't like it. You know, look, I think a great songwriter delivers a great song, a great performer that interprets that great song can always take my, you know, they can always take my imagination. It doesn't matter if it's Kate and Anna McGarrigle, it could be Van Morrison, it could be Robbie Robertson. You know, as long as it starts with a great song and a great interpretation of that song, I love it. But it took bands like the Beatles and Stones and Cream to really turn kids on in the 60s, a lot of little white kids, a lot of very privileged little white kids, onto the music of Robert Johnson and Chuck Berry and Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. And they were revered in Europe, and there was no color barriers. And that's why people like Otis and Miles and, you know, Josephine Baker, I mean, going back as long ago as then, they went there regularly because they were treated as equals and peers, and they were respected. And the Beatles sent a limo, I think, to pick up Otis at the airport when he first came in. I mean, it was so different than what was going on here, you know, where, you know, you didn't even know who wrote Hound Dog. You know, you think of Hound Dog as Elvis, but it wasn't Elvis, right? It was he was doing a cover. So I think you know, we're obviously going through an enormous reality check this year. But again, it's important for guys like me who are either promoters when they were younger or now I'm the promoter of merchandise, to try to pass on the stories and the legends and the music to the next generation, and hope that through merchandise, they discover that music and they want to. And if enough people are wearing AC/DC, enough people will eventually know Highway to Hell, Back in Black, For Those About to Rock, Flick of the Switch, High Voltage, etc. And enough people are wearing David Bowie, hopefully they're going to know more than Aladdin Sane and Ziggy Stardust. They're going to know Let's Dance, and they're going to know Tin Machine Era, and all the various left turns and right turns that David Bowie took. But you know what? If they don't, and they only love 2 albums from David Bowie, that's also good. There's nothing bad about that. But I'm just saying, usually my experience is whenever you meet somebody, you can meet Pink Floyd now, or David Gilmour to deliver you to Pink Floyd. And then eventually you'll go all the way back to Piper at the Gates of Dawn and Saucer Full of Secrets. As a matter of fact, Nick Mason, doing his solo project this last couple of years, celebrating and honoring the earliest Pink Floyd music, has been massively successful, because even the Roger and the David solo tours and the latter Pink Floyd tours didn't play enough of that very, very early music. It was a little bit psychedelic and it was a little different. And now when you see Nick treating it with the Kid Loves and the other musicians that he's surrounded by, that early Pink Floyd music has aged so well.
It's amazing that theater tour.
Whatever you can do to introduce people, you know, to, again, early Miles Davis, early Charlie Parker, because they all contribute to eventually whatever you say you're into.
At what point, I'm not quite sure what year Brockham started. To me, I remember all the shirts in California had the tag Screen Stars. And then at some point,
forget, that's the manufacturer.
Right, I get it. But I know that.
It could have been Hanes Beefy Tees, it could have been Gildan. That was the manufacturer. Only some bands, and only really recently, well, we did it once with Metallica, where we actually took that Screen Stars label out and we put a Metallica label in. But sometimes there's that little copyright line, and it says copyright 1977, so-and-so Inc. You know, so-and-so Inc. is usually owned by the band or their holding company. And sometimes it would also say under license to Brockham. But the answer is pretty well 1976 is when it really started to come on board. I can't remember exactly if it was the same years for Great Southern and Winterland, but 74, 75, 76. Prior to that, it was harder to find merch at all people's tours. And again, Hendrix and Janis Joplin, just that much earlier, it wasn't there. There was no merchandise at Woodstock. The only merchandise at Woodstock was on the stagehands. So whatever we've been able to sell for the past 50 years is really in honor of, but it's not a duplicate of.
Yeah. Now, how does this work? At some point, you become a merch licensing guy where you go out to bands and you say, hey, I want to make merch for you guys and I'm going to sell it around the planet. How does this happen? Do you go to the management? Do you go to the estates? And is it?
I don't think there's any real set way, Dean. And first of all, it's not, I'm not a me, I'm a we. I'm part of a we. I mean, I don't think I could, I couldn't even take this hour with you if I didn't have other people in my life that could that could make me look as good as I do when I look good, and protect me from looking bad. So that's always been there. So, the same way the band has an organization you just described, there's either a business manager or a lawyer, a manager and an agent. Generally speaking, it's one of the first three, the manager, the business manager, or the lawyer, that is either soliciting bids or that you go and you speak to. The manager to promote, to merchandiser relationship does exist, but most often it's the representative who reports to the manager negotiating and coming back and saying, here are some of the reasons why you might want to consider company A over company B. And I like to think we all have points of differentiation. The same way I would like to think that you and Mitch Hedberg, or you and Chris Rock, have all different points of view as stand-up comedians, or any number of people want to say there's a point of differentiation and there's some uniqueness. I think we give and offer very, very great service, and we're very artist friendly. We're very focused on who the crowd is, and we're very, very focused on quality. I'm not a billion-dollar corporation that has a merchandising division like one of the massive record companies. They have a slightly different approach. Their relationship is with the artists throughout the recorded music, and they offer great deals, and some of the great deals they want some strings attached, and that includes merchandising. So I'm competing against artists I can never sign in that scenario, because I can't compete with the record company. So I need to work with acts that want the type of service that our team can provide, that are probably comfortable knowing that we're an independent company and that we will get up a little earlier for them and we'll go to bed a little later for them, and that we don't have a massive roster, so that we can give every client, all being well, as much service as possible. And there's no two ways to a deal. And I'm very proud of the fact that I'm in my third or fourth decade with the Bowie representatives, with the AC/DC representatives, with the Pink Floyd representatives, but I'm equally fascinated or proud of the fact that I'm in my first 6 weeks with Aretha Franklin, and my first 7 weeks with Charlie Parker, and my second year with Bad Company. Even though they've had an enormous career, I never had the opportunity or honor of working with them until just recently. So, there's no set way. The one you like the most is if somebody says you do good work, or I love your product, I see it on kids, or my friend's a musician in this band and he told me to give you a call. Any number of those sort of endorsements are the ones that give you the goosebumps, right? When somebody says, I hear you do good work, I hear you've got a great team. But we try to make sure that what we do for Bowie is different than what we would do for Janis. And not just because the audience is different, because we don't want it to be a slapped logo on the same shirt, any more than, you don't want the record to be the same, right? So we try to really be wearing a bunch of different logos on our foreheads every time we go into a meeting. So every product line is bespoke. Every relationship we have with a client is the one that feels comfortable. And again, we're happy to give up the lion's share of the revenue because we're the lamb. They've written music, it's their legacy, and all we're doing is creating the necessary products, or the coolest products we can, to transfer that key art, whether it started with an album cover or a poster or a logo or a photograph, to transfer that onto the right types of products and do some cool collaborations. Last year, one of the coolest things I ever worked on was the Barbie dressed as Ziggy Stardust. Whoa. You know, we did a deal with Mattel, and you know, Barbie was dressed as Ziggy. That's as good, you know, to me, that's a scrapbook moment. You know, there's a whole bunch of that sort of stuff that can happen in a career, but once in a while you go back and say, hey, you know what? I took that phone call. I'm glad I did. Or they took my pitch and I'm glad they did. And in the end, fans like you or me have something to sort of hang around with and play with in your fan cave.
How does a specific deal go down for merchandise with Bon Scott? Does the band own his likeness? Does that go straight to the family? How do you do an actual Bon Scott deal? Is AC/DC own that?
No, and they wouldn't want to. Bon is a member of AC/DC, you know, a recording artist, and you know, within that world, I mean, they have a partnership, and I'm sure there are lots and lots of results that people are hugely happy with for the last, you know, 45 years. But Bon, when he died, there was no immediate, you know, new deal that was set up. You know, there was a lot of grieving. There wasn't also a back catalog of solo material or, you know, any other, you know, previous entity or iterations of his career that screamed for exploitation or development. So it was only last year that representatives of Bon contacted us and said, you know, we know you do AC/DC and we know whatever part of AC/DC that includes Bon you do and you honor. Is there some room in your mind, and is there some demand that we can create for some Bon specific stuff? So we thought about it, and we did advise the guys that, you know, this approach had been made, and they said, you know, that's great, because, you know, there's a John Lennon line and a Beatles line, and there is a David Gilmour line and a Pink Floyd line. So having a Bon Scott line made some sense, but we don't have, we make sure it's as distinct as possible, that it's Bon as a man, as opposed to, you know, there's a picture of the band, right? Or, you know, it's not intended to compete with, it's intended to complement. And it's also, as we've seen, sometimes a knee-jerk reaction or the proper reaction to an awful lot of bootlegging that takes place on the internet. And so for years, if people are buying unauthorized stuff, and sometimes it's lousy and sometimes it's you know, bad photography or whatever, it doesn't look good on anybody. So one reason besides making money, another good reason for having an official program is to make sure that you can control the unlicensed stuff, and a true fan who quite often doesn't know they're buying bootleg can now start to buy some official stuff. And I do believe that, you know, I've met enough fans to know that even the Japanese pressing of the same record sometimes fits into their collection just because it had a different color vinyl. So, you know, if somebody's always going to buy whatever AC/DC put out, that doesn't mean they wouldn't also love a couple Bon Scott shirts. You know?
Absolutely.
Was, you know, like Kurt Cobain and like Jimmy and like, you know, so many, but Brian Jones, you know, he died too soon.
I really, I'm a vintage shirt freak, so I do appreciate this kind of new high-end, incredible merch coming out in the t-shirt world. People like Made Worn, who make some next level rock t-shirts that look like, I'm not talking about just your standard kind of rub.
We've worked with Blaine in this company, Made Worn, since day one, and his previous company, where he did another sort of game changer that blew everybody's minds with a company called Junk Food, who
Yep.
started with kind of Muppets and other nostalgia type art, and then segued it into the perfect recreation of original shirts. But he did it super soft, and he did it with some really great colors. And he was the reason why rock t-shirts evolved past Spencer Gifts and Hot Topic into places like Urban Outfitters or Free People or Anthropology. With Made Worn, his customer has a higher price point, so it's much more sort of limited edition. And he literally, with his team, makes the shirts almost one at a time, as the old-fashioned way, literally, on the ground, pounding it out, making sure that it really does look authentic. And he's kind of like a Renaissance man. He's got an awful lot of things that he does really, really well. But one of the things he does more than anything is he honors those original musicians that he's recreating stuff for. And recently did a beautiful thing for us on Woodstock, but he's done great work for us on the Floyd and AC/DC, and he does it for other bands as well that I don't work with. So he's one of those guys. But if you think about a true pyramid in fashion, he does the runway piece that leads to the affordable piece that eventually leads to the value shopper piece, because there's nothing wrong with a rock fan having a budget that only leads them to Target or Walmart. There's nothing wrong with somebody else who can, shop at Kohl's or Penny's, or, as I said, Urban Outfitters, or that style of shop. And it could lead you to Bloomingdale's, and it can lead you to Fred Segal. And you can shop for your favorite band in all those tiers of distribution. Sometimes you have a brand like Calvin Klein or Tommy Hilfiger, and if you go upstairs, you don't want to go downstairs, and if you go downstairs, you can never go upstairs. With our great vintage artists, like I said, Creedence and Fogerty, all these people, you can be in all tiers of distribution. You have a slightly different customer, slightly different price point, slightly different product. And so there are companies that we work with, like Chaser and Daydreamer and Made Worn, as you've said, and there's so many of them that specialize in boutique stuff and creating the demand. And then there's other fabulous companies like BioWorld and Hybrid and Sea Life that specialize in maximizing demand. And then there's these young upstart companies, Rock and Pins as an example, where they just revere the artist enough and they want to make money at one pin at a time. They're happy to just make great little stuff and find an audience that might have shopped at Amoeba or what used to be called a record store.
Yeah. I think personally, me being such a lunatic on the rock shirts, I think Blaine is definitely the greatest guy that I've ever seen. He's a friend of mine. I've had him on the show, and it's his knowledge and his eye for detail are mind-boggling to me, especially in the fit and the feel of the shirt.
Well, one of the things that we saw, there was another guy whose dad had started a company called Starter, and he created this company called Trunk, and they were pre-Junk Food, the first to really try the vintage scenario. And they had gone to some of the real good shops in New York, what comes around goes around. And they would see that, an Elton John shirt selling for $100, and they say, well, we can recreate it and maybe sell it for 50. And Brad Beckerman was very, very innovative and very successful. But unfortunately, in my opinion, he didn't have his actual garment evolve enough. So if you had 3 or 4 trunk shirts, they all felt the same, even though the art was different. And they weren't as designed for women. And then Junk Food came along, and women much preferred it. It was also a little bit more affordable, so it had way wider access. And I think Blaine, who made a very, 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 very big business with Junk Food, I think he learned from that. And I think right now with Made Worn, he doesn't ever want to really be in Target. He wants to be in the super best shops in Tokyo or in Korea, only 2 or 3 shops in LA or San Francisco. And that's a good design. So he wants to stay at the top. And he's the type of guy that says, this is the price, take it or leave it. And you don't think of him saying it in an arrogant way. He's just saying, I pay my people. You know, if
Yeah.
I pay my people, that's why I have to charge, you know, I make a great product and it's in LA, it's not in Vietnam or China or, you know, Sri Lanka or Honduras. Not that they're bad countries, but they don't pay their people. I pay my people, right? So I love guys like Blaine that can get away with that, because too many times, unfortunately, the pressure from Target or from Walmart or from this other chain of distribution leads you to either taking a bit of the quality out of your garment or taking a bit of the domesticity out of it, and you trade labor for distance, you know, and somehow, and it's still perverted, it's cheaper to land a shirt from halfway around the planet, because somebody, even with FedEx or even with a boat or whatever, it's cheaper to land that shirt than it is to make it here. And that's the perversion. And part of the perversion is we don't pay people enough money in America, pure and simple. And we say to somebody who's working in a burger shack, don't be looking for $15 an hour. Be happy with the $10 an hour, because you can always go to Walmart and get a pair of jeans at $19. And when I was a kid, that pair of jeans was $39. And now it's cheaper than ever to buy a watch and a phone and all this other stuff. And so they rationalize the $10 an hour. The reality is we should pay people a living wage, right? And if we did, people wouldn't have to go offshore to make their stuff. And people wouldn't think, I have to pay, you know, like that $10 is a good price for a t-shirt, because when you charge $10 at Walmart, you buy it for $5. And when you buy it for $5, you make it for $2. And there's only so much that goes to the artist or the artist's representatives. And that same t-shirt at a concert, at the Forum or, you know, AT&T Park or whatever, you know, that's going for $40 and $50. Is that the right price? I don't know, but somewhere between $10 and $40, the Walmart shirt can definitely sell for $20, and everybody would make some more money. The bands, the Blaines, the Walmarts, and the only problem for that is that the public aren't walking into Walmart making $15 and $20 and $30 an hour. They're walking in making $6 and $7 and $8, and it's 2020, and we should all be shot.
It's you're so right there. You're so right. It's so brutal what's going on. Like the uh it's right up there with my buddy. My buddy put up a meme on Instagram, and he's a musician all his life, a working musician, and he said, I just got in a time machine and I went to 2045, and it turns out the musician still makes $100 a gig. You know, that's just
No sound check, no dressing room, and $100. Yeah. Started as a promoter, then we should boogie. We were able to lobby the agents. When Bill was doing a lot of shows in San Francisco, and there were, again, that sort of early punk circuit, my promoting company didn't always get what we wanted because somebody else already had first dibs on Journey, or already had played Styx, or already had played somebody else. So I, as much as I did have my connections in Toronto and Montreal, phenomenal partnerships that led me to getting Rush and Kiss and, you know, AC/DC, that wasn't enough shows. So we worked with a lot of emerging artists. And I'm very proud to say I promoted the very first Clash show in North America, U2 wow. First tour, you know, the Police on their first tour. All of this leads to, in those days, you weren't told, this is the logo, take it or leave it. This is the tour ad map, take it or leave it. Here's the tour opening act, take it or leave it. You still got to be a bit of an entrepreneur. And we were very lucky that we were able to book some great bands and some obscure bands, Susie and the Banshees and XTC and 999, not just, you know, Elvis or Tom Petty. And so we were lobbying for most of those bands to play a place called the Commodore Ballroom in Vancouver. It had been around since the days of Benny Goodman, spring dance floor, held 1,000 people, rock and roll, phenomenal. Originally had been used for people like Muddy Waters. And you know, the promoter, the club owner said to me, look, if you can fill Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays, just I'm taking that Saturday night for Muddy Waters or for George Thorogood. So we, you know, we started to bring in all these bands, but we were able to book a lot of Vancouver acts as the opening act. And in those days, it was like, it was what you just said. It was $100, case of beer, no sound check, take it or leave it. That was the standard fee, because otherwise all the other money we really had to earmark to get, you know, whoever the band was that we were promoting, because our tickets were $6 and $7. Let's not kid ourselves. It was 1977, 78, 79, and 80 when that began. And, you know, I look back and, you know, playing with B-52s and the Talking Heads and so many artists at the beginning or the second album, first album, second album. Those are highlights of my career, because too often you get the opportunity of seeing them when they've become so big that they are the arena act. And some of that early days simplicity before there was, that big production, it was all only about the music, and you could still sit there and say, this is going to be a huge act. And you could see that with U2, you could see that with The Clash. The same way that I'm sure if I'd been a kid seeing The Who for the first time in a ballroom in England in 64, 65, I would have said the same thing. They're going to end up in stadiums. But I mean, I don't think we ever knew that was going to be a stadium business, but you could at least fast forward to they're not going to stay in these ballrooms.
Before we get out of here, first of all, I want to thank you for talking to me. Absolutely, your knowledge is incredible, and it's an honor to have you on, man. I just love people like you that have been in the business forever. I love to talk to people like you, because you get the real deal out there. A lot of people are just really clueless how it works. They think the bands are gazillionaires. They think everybody's ripping off the fan, the tickets are too high, all this stuff, over and over. So to have people like you on is great. I got a question for you. I can see that cardboard Angus in the background. You have to have a warehouse of stuff that's from 60s, 70s, 80s t-shirts and stuff. You still got that stuff?
I wish I could answer this to the affirmative. And, sometimes you've got a garage and you don't realize that you can still get dry rot in your road box that's got 50 shirts or 100 shirts in it. Sometimes you move across the world and some things don't make the cut. I remember having my first ever Humble Pie t-shirt, and I went looking for it one year and I said, whatever happened to it? And my wife said, you gave that away, or it was given away 7 years ago. So the answer is, I'm not as clever as I should have been. And I do have some great stuff, but literally from time to time, I buy my own shirts back. As a matter of fact, I can show you right here. This is the very first Genesis tour I worked on in America.
Wow.
Wuthering tour. And this was the crew gift jacket.
Wow.
I bought this on eBay. Just to have it in my collection and maybe to recreate it. So, listen, I do come across a lot of our stuff. I love the fact that the Brinton, right now, there is I think it's a Tribe Called Quest shirt selling for more on eBay than any other Brockham shirt is. I think it's like $1,500 or something. And I'm real proud of that. Warehouses, what my wife says, if you don't look at it in 6 months, you didn't need it, right? And I have two storage lockers here in New York where, I shudder every time I have a spare day. I should go in there and really look and see what I've got. Maybe there's some good stuff, but I'm a collector. I don't really think about reselling. All these guys that resell stuff where they line up to get running shoes and they buy 2 pairs and they sell one or they scalp one. I've never been that guy. I just, whatever, I like to share my memories. And I do have a pretty good cross-section of stuff, but compared to the stuff I've created or my team has created, I've got a fraction of it. And that's why I like the internet. That's why I like bumping into guys like you. That's why I like working with guys like Blaine that'll go find the shirt and he'll recreate it and we'll keep that story alive. But some of the people like Blaine or some of the other young puppies that we work with, I call them mad scientists. They don't know the difference between a parking lot bootleg shirt and a legit one. And quite often, and Trunk were the first people that come to me and said, this is so sick, let's reproduce it. And I told, that was a parking lot shirt. I'm not sure we can get away with it. And I did have the confidence to walk in to Floyd and to the Stones and ask them for the right to actually say, let's make some money off this for the first time ever. And so that old art, not only the old original authentic art, but some of that old bootleg art has now found its way into modern homes. People like Blaine still, as often as possible, will come to me with a bootleg AC/DC and say, we got to recreate this. And I, again, always have to go and double check the band are okay with it. But, the bootlegger, to their credit, talks to the customer first, talks to the customer last, doesn't pay sales tax, doesn't pay the band, doesn't pay the venue, probably doesn't pay, you know, a lot of other things, has a lousy shirt, great artwork, first guys to do black t-shirts, first guys to do two-sided t-shirts, first guys to do event shirts. They taught us an awful lot because unfortunately in the beginning, quite often, you wanted the small little chest print that was groovy and you know what? That's okay for you and your crew. The band the audience wants to say, guess where I was last night? When they go to a bar or they go to school or they go to work the next day. And so it's got to be loud and proud. So we've learned an awful lot from both the bootleggers and now these young puppies that are sitting there surfing the net, coming across these shirts. And I'm proud of the fact that I'm a good advocate for trying something different. You know, I'm not a disruptor completely, but I do like the fact that we have 700 different versions of Dark Side of the Moon artwork, and there's only one album cover.
Wow. It was funny because I was always a snob as a kid. I wouldn't buy those parking lot shirts because I called them floaters. Once you washed them once, the back would just float and it would shrink in a weird way.
They're definitely, they got better quality-wise, but quite often they were what we call seconds. And they got them for so cheap because there was a flaw in them to begin with. That's how they could afford to sell it to you for $10 or under. And they still can afford to do it for all sorts of reasons I just described. You know, they don't have to pay that 30% or 25% to the venue, and they don't have to pay a penny to my client or the tax man. So those are, you know, pretty good reasons for why you can, you know, undercut people. But for every great bootleg design, there are probably 10 that are just reprehensible. And in the end, you know, I got spanked a bit. One day I was at Pink, morning after a Stone show. We'd played the LA Forum the night before it was the tour. I think we played a stadium, a club, and an arena on the whole, each city. It was the Licks tour. And I was standing in line, gonna get a hot dog. It was near Chrome Hearts, and we did a deal with Chrome Hearts, so one of our first Stones licenses in really high end. And their office was nearby. And 2 or 3 people in front of me, the guy was wearing a bootleg shirt from the night before. And we all ended up 10, 15 minutes later in that little sort of area with the picnic, the tables behind Pink's in LA, a very famous hot dog joint. And I kind of, in my stupid Larry David way, gave him a bit of a talking to. And he said, "You're an idiot. I've spent over $1,000 on your merchandise already. I've been to 9 different shows. I get like products from all around the world. I'm a fucking collector. Stop giving me a hard time." And from that day onward, I realized, you know what? If I can't give them what they want, they bought it anyway. They, you know, they had everything they wanted inside, and they still saw something outside. I said goodnight to them, and they said hello to somebody else that was competing with me. I had to get over that chip on my shoulder, but the reality is they're the best fans of them all because they're super collectors. Now, you can be a snob, you're right, and you can say, I don't want to condone bad behavior, but a super fan buys bootlegs as well, bootleg records, you know, before before the Dylan and the Dead and all these other people started authenticating bootlegs, fans were buying them anyway because they didn't give a shit. They just wanted to hear another version, A Whole Lot of Love.
Yeah. Oh, I bought bootleg CDs all my life and vinyl. It was just more of me of the quality of the shirt. It was, I didn't have any money, so if I bought a shirt, I didn't want it to be destroyed the next day. One last question before we get out of here. I don't understand. I've been going to shows for 40 something years. I don't understand.
You started at 7?
Oh, I'm 54.
You started at 3?
Yeah, I'm 54.
So, all right, so you started at 10. Okay.
12 or something. How are the bootleggers getting away with being right at the fucking front doors of the venues now? How is this happening? I'm hearing, before you answer me this, I'm hearing there's payola going on with the venues. They're kicking back and stuff, but they're right there, dude, right out front.
Yeah, definitely in places that, like Mexico City, it's kind of like a store in front of, you know, they set up a tent city. They're probably partners with the police in Mexico. There are stories that had never been authenticated, that Colonel Parker had made money on both sides. He was making money with the bootleggers, and I don't know if Elvis was, but the Colonel was, and then he was making it inside. The cops like to think that crowd control and all other issues are more important. We have, though, I mean, I can tell you, not with a warehouse, but I can tell you in my career, and probably my competitors can say the same thing, we've confiscated hundreds of thousands of bootleg shirts. We have to get a restraining order, a proper injunction. We have to prove to the court that we have the rights. Then we have to hire either off-duty cops or marshals. We have to do it without any violence whatsoever. We have to grab them 5 shirts at a time, because no smart bootlegger has more than 5 on them at a time. We very rarely, it's like drugs, you very rarely get right all the way back to the manufacturer or the head of the head of the pack. And it's more like on some tours, if we are very aggressive, we have 30 or 40 bootleg security out, we can come to a détente. And I'm not saying that I'm proud of this, but sometimes we'll say to them, we'll give you if you give us the in, we'll give you the out. And what I meant by that was they stay away, or they go way back. They go all the way to the train station or the bus depot. They stay away from the venue on the in. I mean, they're out there, but they're just not like flies. And as we say goodnight to our customer, they're going to meet them again. Right? So we don't try to confiscate after the show as much as we confiscate and control before the show. That's kind of a détente, but the reality is that not all bands have got the budget to be able to afford to have a full-time security person on the road for the merch company, and to be able to afford to get a $20,000 or $25,000 injunction and be able to go through the whole thing. So a big band can, a moderate-sized band can't. And a moderate-sized band can still be very popular in markets like LA or San Francisco, where bootleggers don't have to travel. They can just wake up, go get the shirts, from some guy, and some bootleggers are national, some bootleggers are regional, but some are very local. And those local bootleggers can bootleg a show at the Fillmore if they want.
Yeah. Well,
so, Dean, let me just say one thing. We that are in the marketing business spend money on full page ads, whether it's advertising a movie or a concert or a Louis Vuitton product. We in the marketing business make radio spots or billboards. In the concert business, our groups are blessed that people want to buy things that advertise the band. So instead of paying a kid to wear a shirt, they're paying you to wear the shirt. It is a surreal form of and unique kind of fandom, and I just don't want to ever see it go away. And while it's an ecosystem, and there's some bad guys and there's some good guys and there's some greedy guys, there's some unreasonable people, the reality is this is a high form of flattery that somebody's willing to pay you money to walk around saying Pink Floyd, AC/DC. That's a great thing, and I'm glad that I have a little role to play in it. And that the bands have agreed to let me play that role, and that they participate, because it's their DNA that helps me do my job. And whenever somebody, whether it's a band member, a band representative, says, "Hey, they never liked that beard, so let's not use that photograph of him wearing that beard," that's the sort of thing you want, the authenticity there, because you don't ever want to bump into an interview where somebody says, "Yeah, I really wish we hadn't done such and such," right? And you were part of the such and such decision.
Well, thank you so much for doing the show. Real quick, name of the company now?
Perryscope Productions, based here in New York. 10 amazing people that work with me in all facets of product development, e-commerce, research, and a great partner who's been with me for many, many, many years. Started with me in Brockham, now a full partner in Perryscope, and waiting for the concert business to come back like everybody else, but really thrilled that we can do direct-to-consumer transactions on official band stores, and that we've been able to find this network of stores around the world that want to put rock and roll on people, not just Manchester United shirts and not just Mickey Mouse shirts.
Well, thank you so much, man, and look forward to meeting you one day when I'm back in New York. I'm always there until the pandemic, of course, but it would be great to see you.
Well, I would love that as well, and maybe next time on your coast we'll hook up. Either way, we have to let the scientists help us get to that point.
I heard you, man. Thank you so much. And do you have a Instagram or any kind of stuff like that?
Yeah, it's Perryscope Productions on Instagram. It's Norman Perry, I think, on Instagram, and it's perryscope.us if you want to check out who our amazing client roster is. And thank you very much for asking me to be on and sharing some time with us.
I love you, man. It was a great, great interview, and I'll see you soon.
All right, nice one. Cheers.
Thanks. Thanks.
All the best to you.
Thank you.